Howdy and welcome, students, to lecture number 7, where I will continue in our chain of lectures on the important concepts of the geographic perspective. In the previous lectures, I have spoken to you on the concept of location and how geographers collect and classify locational data for the Earth, the concept of place and how geographers, cartographers, help to identify those locations as unique places and name them and identify them. The concept of human-environment interaction, or how humans shape the environment, how the environment shapes people, and some of the terminology and major theories within the study of cultural ecology. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about movement, or simply the mobility of people, goods, and ideas across the surface of the planet, and some of the ways we refer to that movement and distribution of people before and after and as they move. We can begin our discussion on movement by talking about distribution, okay? Quite simply, distribution is one of our vocabulary words, refers to the arrangement of something across Earth's surface, whatever that something is, right? Animals, people, light poles, homes. We're going to be looking at 3 major properties of this idea of distribution: density, concentration, and pattern, okay? Density refers to the frequency with which something exists within a given unit of area, right? So given a particular square block of a city, we might talk about it being high density or low density based on how many people there are there, right? If there's lots and lots of people in that one city block, we might say it's high density. If there's very few people, low density. Concentration refers to the spread of something over a given area, or, not to be redundant, its actual kind of distribution, right? We might talk about things when referring to concentration as being clustered or dispersed, right? Clustered if they're located very close together, or dispersed if they're located more spread apart. And then another property of distribution that geographers will refer to is pattern, all right? The sort of geometric shape that it creates across the surface of the Earth, right? And you might hear, again, this referred to as geometric pattern or linear pattern or an irregular pattern based on that arrangement. And we'll see some specific examples of that here in a moment. So looking at this image here, you can see those 3 characteristics of distribution that we talked about: density, concentration, and pattern, all right? On the left-hand side here, you see example A on the top, example B on the bottom for density. Take a minute thinking of your definitions from the last slide and think about which of these 2 examples would be high density, which would be relatively low density. In this case, the example on the bottom, example B, is going to be high density, right? In that same area of a picture, there are 12 homes versus, half as many in that same area above. In the center, you see examples of concentration. Those homes that are all clustered together, right? We would say those are kind of highly concentrated or clustered in their distribution. The homes on the example above, or example A, we would say those are more dispersed, right? Same amount of homes in the area, but they're spread apart from each other. And then for the concept of pattern, we see that on the right-hand side, where you can see an example of a linear pattern in example A, all the homes in a line or in a kind of row, and an irregular pattern below, where the homes are sort of, catty corner or sort of scattered about from each other at varying distances from the road. Another important idea that's related to the concept of movement is the term hearth. All right. In order to understand how things sort of spread or diffuse, it's important to start by examining some point of origin, or this idea of a hearth, right? The region from which some innovative idea or cultural trait originates. In world history, we talk about early cultural hearths, or some of the areas where some of the world's first civilizations began as they pioneered the art of agriculture. Some of those hearths were the Nile River, where the ancient civilization of Egypt began, or the Indus River Valley, where you can find the similarly named Indus River Valley civilization, or Mesopotamia, where you find one of the oldest civilizations, Mesopotamian civilization, the Sumerians, that gave us some of the earliest writing systems, right? So these are hearths for things like agriculture or writing, and civilization in general. But you can have hearths for all kinds of different technologies or culture groups, languages, etc. This is how some of these are mapped out. In this case, these early cultural hearths and agricultural hearths, as you found them arrayed across the planet. Although we'll talk about several other kinds of hearths, which oftentimes, depending on how far back you go in time, where you're talking about the hearth of something cultural, it generally falls into one of these hearths that you see here. Whether we're talking about language or agriculture or metalworking, you can find similar hearths for a lot of these ancient innovations. Now, if hearth refers to where something begins or originates, diffusion is a term that's going to help us refer to the process of that thing spreading from one place to another over time. And within the field of geography, there are a few different ways that geographers talk about diffusion, the spread of something over the surface of the earth. We're going to talk about 4 distinct ways, all right? Relocation diffusion, and then 3 other kinds of diffusion that are all referred to together as expansion diffusion, but individually are known as hierarchical diffusion, contagious diffusion, and stimulus diffusion. So let's take them one at a time. Relocation diffusion is pretty simple, okay? It is the spread of a feature or trend through the bodily movement of people from one place to another, right? People physically taking things from one location to another by moving there. Now that can be stuff. You have a similar image as this, I think, in your textbook, which shows the diffusion of euro coins throughout the country of France, right? The idea being that those coins started somewhere else, and through tourism and travel and purchases throughout the country worked their way out to be distributed and diffused throughout the entire nation. But it doesn't just work with material objects, right? People bring all kinds of things with them when they move. They bring their cultures, their languages, their religions, and all those things can travel by relocation diffusion, disease, etc. So the example here we see of euro coins, right, we've discussed, but you can think about the movement of European settlers from Europe to the Americas or various parts of the globe, and the spread of Christianity that followed that relocation, right? Or the movement of all kinds of fruits and vegetables and animals that took place during the Columbian exchange, right? Between the old world of Europe and Africa and Asia and the new world of North and South America following the arrival of Columbus into the Caribbean. Now, expansion diffusion refers to the spread of an innovation or an idea through a population in an area in such a way that the number of those influenced grows continuously larger, resulting in an expanding area of dissemination. So while relocation diffusion might bring a religion from one continent to another, the spread of that religion amongst a population is going to take place through some form of expansion diffusion. Now remember, we're going to break this down into a couple different kinds of particular forms of expansion diffusion: hierarchical, contagious, and stimulus diffusion. Hierarchical diffusion is the spread of a feature or trend from one key person or node of authority or power to other persons or places of authority or power. The important thing to understand here is that when something is being spread through hierarchical diffusion, it is skipping a lot of things that it might otherwise come in contact with, right? One of the examples we could think of might be certain fashion trends, right, that often diffuse through hierarchical diffusion. Imagine some trend beginning in a fashionable spot of the earth like New York City or Paris, France. The idea is that as that trend, that cool way of wearing your hat or scarf or something spreads, it's going to spread to these other very trendy locations first, right? That when people start wearing their hair or clothes in a certain way in New York City, it's much more likely that that trend is going to diffuse to another important node or location related to fashion before hitting the spots in between. All right. So somebody starts wearing a cool scarf in New York and that catches on. People in LA might engage in that fashion trend before somebody in the Midwest does, right? It might bypass that entire geographical area and go from this important large area to this other important large area and skip the towns and people in between. Okay, so it sort of diffuses through some kind of social or economic hierarchy from important locations to other important spots and maybe bypasses areas in between. I believe your textbook gives the example of like hip hop or rap music emerging in like these large urban centers and diffusing to other large urban centers, right? Starting in, let's say Brooklyn, New York in the 70s or something, and maybe diffusing rapidly to places like Los Angeles or San Diego and things like that, and bypassing, again, all those places in the Midwest that wouldn't catch on to that style of music until later. Contagious diffusion is, I think, oftentimes, especially right now, kind of one of the more easier ones to understand or envision. Contagious diffusion can be defined as the rapid or widespread diffusion of a feature or trend throughout a population by contact from person to person. In this case, there is no hierarchy. Anybody that comes into contact with that thing that is being diffused is likely to transmit it onto someone else. Now, the easiest way to think about this is through disease, right? Diseases transmit through contagious diffusion, among other kinds of diffusion, right? But basically, if you come into contact to somebody with, COVID or something, you are way more likely you're going to maybe get that disease and transfer it to someone else. The terminology of contagious diffusion has kind of worked its way into how we talk about popular things on the internet, right? If you have a video that gets shared a lot on the internet, we'll say it's gone viral, right? Something goes viral when it's shared heavily on the internet. But again, it has that idea of you coming into contact with it and you're almost, compelled to send it out and share it with other people, not necessarily disseminate it through some hierarchy of information. And then there's ideas that some religions, right, that lack missionaries like maybe other ones have, are spreading through a process of contagious diffusion, just through the day-to-day interactions non-members of that religion might have with members of that religion until it kind of rubs off on them in a sense. Stimulus diffusion is the last of those forms of expansion diffusion, and maybe the least common, but is one that you might have seen in some form or another, okay? Stimulus diffusion can be defined as a form of diffusion in which a cultural adaptation is created as a result of the introduction of a cultural trait from another place, okay? What that means is that it's a concept or idea being spread, but then kind of modified or adapted to new users or people embracing that original idea. Okay, so some ways that you might think of this is, one, the example that I have on here is McDonald's is a restaurant chain that has diffused globally, right? You can find McDonald's all over the earth. But in diffusing all over the planet, McDonald's found that its menu was not equally applicable to all cultures, right? That some cultures were more vegetarian, for example, or ate more fish, or used different kinds of flavors and spices in their food. And so McDonald's has adapted their menu to those local variations of culture. And that's a great example of stimulus diffusion, where those locations have McDonald's, but it is not a McDonald's necessarily. That's how we would, imagine a McDonald's menu, right? They serve totally different items that you couldn't get in the United States. Another example I like to give is maybe thinking of early computers. If you think about some of the first computer systems and the ways that people navigated those early systems, using things like DOS, right, where you actually, the operating system for your computer had you typing in lines of code, right, to open up certain files or access certain parts of the computer. Well, people kept the idea of, transistors and processors and a machine that does what a computer does, but went through all kinds of various forms of operating systems, right? Whether that was a kind of Apple Macintosh style operating system, or Windows or Linux, that, systems that are using, mice, little rolling, mice-based systems with files that you can click on and kind of visualize on your computer. Another way of thinking it might be about like video game systems. The original video game systems like Atari or something, they were games that you played through, computer-like systems that attached to your television, but the form that system took, right, as an Atari with its kind of roller board and joystick combination, was really distinct from later video game systems like Nintendo that had, handheld controllers with a D-pad and buttons that you're going to push to navigate things on the screen, right? So the idea is you're kind of keeping this original concept, but modifying it, adapting it in some way to some local area. So some examples of some of the things we're talking about there: contrasting contagious and hierarchical diffusion, right? Two different kinds of expansion diffusion. Contagious diffusion on the left, where some patient zero comes into contact with a disease or viral video and just shares it. And anybody that comes into contact with that person is, catching on to that viral trend or in fact virus. And on the right there, hierarchical diffusion, where some innovation is spreading from an important power node to some other important power node and maybe bypassing individuals in between. An important part of talking about the movement and diffusion of things across the surface of the Earth is talking about the idea of space-time compression, which sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, but it's kind of a simple idea. Space-time compression refers to the reduction in time it takes for something to diffuse to a distant place on the Earth because of improved communication and transportation systems. So basically means that because we've gotten better at communicating and faster at transporting things around the world, things diffuse a lot faster than they once did. This is a great image that I think is from your textbook as well, but I love this map. It shows a few different voyages that have taken place, right? The first one being the trip of Columbus across the Atlantic from Spain to the Caribbean, where that first trip in 1492 took Columbus and his crew something like 37 days to cross the ocean. The Titanic's voyage in 1912 would have taken, tragically did not quite take, but would have taken about 80 hours, right, for a steam-powered locomotive to take that trip that took Columbus 37 days would have been accomplished by the Titanic or ships similar to it in about 80 days. In 1927, the American aviator Charles Lindbergh took the first transatlantic airplane flight from New York to Paris, and it took him about 33 and a half hours. So you can see this gigantic gigantic reduction in time that's happening there, right? And in 1962, one of the first American astronauts, John Glenn, orbited the Earth 3 times in 5 hours. All right. Those are all great examples of space-time compression. What took Columbus over a month to do, you could accomplish in an airplane in about 5 or 6 hours today, right? Crossing the Atlantic. And in a sense, that means that space and time have become kind of compressed, right? The world is smaller for us than it was for our ancestors in a very real way. Now, despite space-time compression, there is still this concept of the friction of distance, all right? Friction of distance is a geographic term that refers to the idea that when things are farther apart, they tend to be less well connected. And that's for a couple reasons, some of which are obvious, right? Things that are at a shorter distance from each other, the travel between them is going to be less expensive. The construction of alternate travel networks, more expansive roads and trains and buses and airplane routes and things like that. Well, all of that is going to be less expensive to set up as well. And your travel from point A to point B, if those distances are shorter, is going to take less time. You're going to be more likely to make that trip. A lot more people are going to be more likely to make that trip, right? There is a lot of interaction between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, for example, that are at relatively short distances. The larger the distance, the more expensive all of that stuff is going to be, right? Your personal expenses from point A to point B, but also it's going to be more expensive to construct roads and trains and things like that. And you're a lot more likely to be limited in the options that you have to travel from one spot to another. All right. And this is that friction of distance, right? What's going to slow down and kind of grind your interaction to a halt is the friction caused by distance itself. A term that's related to this and kind of describes a similar thing is distance decay. Distance decay is defined as the diminishing in importance and eventual disappearance of a phenomenon with increasing distance from its origin, right? That as you get farther from the spot where something started, you're likely to see it become less and less common or even die out altogether. And so the way I like to think about it is distance decay is kind of the effect. The friction of distance is the process through which distance decay is happening. But basically the idea of distance decay is that, again, the greater the distance between something, the less interaction there's going to be. A final but complicated idea we can explore in this lecture here is globalization. The idea that as more and more things have moved around the globe, as culture has diffused more and more readily, and as interaction increases faster and faster between all parts of the globe, it's led to the world being more and more interconnected, something that is referred to as globalization, okay? The definition we're going to be working with is something like this: the expansion of economic, political, and cultural processes to the point that they become global in their scale and their impact. A quote that I like by a geographer here is that with globalization, we are living not so much in a world without boundaries or in a world without geography, but more literally in a world as opposed to a neighborhood or region or country, or however you want to sort of break that down. So what is it? Okay, globalization refers to both a set of sort of processes and actions and a set of outcomes or results. All right. It refers to a set of processes that are globally kind of increasing interactions between countries, deepening the relationships, and also kind of increasing the amount of interdependence that countries have with one another. We see this right now through some of our struggles with COVID and trying to acquire things like masks or certain kinds of foodstuffs where we rely on other countries to produce some of those things or medicines for us. Globalization is increasing all of that without the regard for borders, right? For example, all of the clothes you're probably wearing, for example, were made somewhere else, right? With cotton probably grown in some country also that's not related to where those clothes were actually made, right? That's a great example of the interdependence of countries and the globalization of economic things like making clothes. But globalization also refers to outcomes, outcomes that are unevenly distributed, right? Not all of the world is sharing in the profits of globalization equally or in the negatives of globalization equally, right? It has uneven distribution. It varies across scales, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But globalization has different effects at the global or national scale than it does at the local scale, right? And you see it manifests differently at those scales. But those outcomes are being experienced sort of throughout the world without regard for borders. Currently, in our country and throughout the world, globalization is controversial, and people argue for it and against it in a number of different ways. All right. It's not really for us to talk about if it's good or bad, but to just try to understand some of those arguments and what they sound like. The pro globalization argument goes something like this: that the backbone of globalization is trade, essentially. And economists look to trade as a way to support globalization sometimes by saying that the free trade of countries being able to freely engage in economic relationships with anybody sort of throughout the world helps all the countries in the world, since they're able to specialize in what they can produce most efficiently. All right. We'll talk about that a lot throughout the year. Another kind of point in the pro-globalization argument would say that globalization promotes innovation and greater use of technology by, again, sort of allowing certain areas to specialize, or by allowing an idea from one part of the world to disseminate throughout the world, and those countries to be able to engage in competition by creating innovations of their own that are similar to it, right? Another point is that globalization has helped to open many closed political systems, that countries like China have been opened up to a more capitalist, free market way of doing business because of globalization, right? Because of the global demand for Chinese labor and factory power and manufacturing ability. Pro-globalization argument is that it has broadened the horizons of many people worldwide, that a more globalized world and greater connections have meant a actual bigger world for people, right? An exposure to cultures and languages and religions that are unlike their own, and led to more and more people that might describe themselves as sort of global citizens, right? People that are connected in a very real way to all those different economic systems and religions and belief systems and languages and so on. Now, the anti-globalization argument looks something like this: that globalization has increased the gap between rich and poor countries, right? Through the same means that pro-globalization people say that it's helped them, right? That some countries are specializing in doing low skill, low wage work, and some countries are specializing in high wage, high skill work, right? And that globalization is kind of widening the gap there and keeping people locked in the different spectrums of labor, all right? Another kind of anti-globalization point is that the rich sort of MDC countries of the world are able to impose their kind of economic and cultural values on the less developed countries of the world because of the economic disparity. Another point might be that globalization has led to an increased use of the world's resources with adverse environmental impacts that we're going to talk about throughout the year, but which you've started exploring even in chapter 1, things like climate change through a globalized spread of certain fossil fuel technologies, and the world globally increasing our reliance on those resources. Other arguments look at the idea that in a globalized world, traditional methods of income for a lot of cultures are not competitive, right? Things like small-scale subsistence agriculture, farmers growing enough food for them and their families to eat, is not competitive in a global marketplace, and oftentimes is hindered and hurt by a country opening up to a global market. And another amongst many, many anti-globalization arguments that you might find besides these ones is that it is an increased intercultural animosities, all right? That by more cultures interacting more frequently, it's led to more problems between those cultures than at a time when people were more isolated in their respective parts of the globe. Although, again, you only have to look in history to find that, you know, those animosities were just one boat ride away a lot of the time.
Skilled craftsmen.
So again, you won't be able to sort of see this here, but normally I like to make this a little bit more relevant or identifiable by listening to speeches from current and past presidents on globalization.
Are now in a state of total
Our current President
disrepair.
Trump has at different times given speeches and said things that can be construed as sort of anti-globalization. When he's talked about our competition with countries like China or losing out on manufacturing jobs that have gone overseas to China, those are a kind of anti-globalization argument, right? Making the point that America would be better off if we were less globalized, right? If we were not making as much stuff in other countries
by
like
powerful
China,
corporations,
for example, right? That those
media
jobs
elites,
would still be
and political
here in the United
dynasties.
States.
The people who rigged the system for their benefit will do anything and say anything to keep things exactly the way they are.
In other words, we can't simply return to the strategies of the past.
That have advocated at times,
for we're living through an age of fundamental economic transformation.
By Obama that says
technology has changed the way we live,
is becoming more
and the way the world does business.
And people need
the collapse of the Soviet Union, the advance of capitalism, have vanquished old challenges to America's global leadership. But new challenges have emerged from China and India, and Eastern Europe, even countries like Brazil. Jobs and industries can move to any country with an internet connection and willing workers. And Michigan's children will grow up facing competition not just from kids in California or South Carolina, but also from young people in Beijing and Bangalore. You know, a few years ago, I saw a picture of this new reality during a visit to Google's headquarters in California. Towards the end of the tour, I was brought into a room where there was a three-dimensional image of the Earth that rotated on a large flat panel monitor. And across this image, there were countless lights in different colors all around this globe. And I asked what those lights signified, and a young engineer explained that the lights represented all of the internet searches taking place all around the world. Each color represented a different language. And the image was mesmerizing, a picture of a world where old boundaries are disappearing, a world where communication, connection, and competition can come from anywhere. Now, there are some who believe that we must try to turn back the clock on this new world. That the only chance to maintain our living standard is to build a fortress around America, to stop trading with other countries, to shut down immigration, rely on old industries. I disagree. Not only is it impossible to turn back the tide of globalization, but efforts to do so can actually make us worse off. So rather than fear the future, we have to embrace it. I have no doubt that America can compete and succeed in the 21st century. And I know as well that more than anything else, success will not depend on our government. It will depend on the dynamism and determination and innovation of the American people. We have the best workers on earth here in Flint and here in Michigan. We work harder and we work better. Here in Flint, it was the private sector and American workers that helped turn lumber into the wagons that sent this country west. It was the American worker that built the tanks that faced down fascism and that turned out the automobiles that were the cornerstone of America's manufacturing boom. But at critical moments of transition like this one, success has also depended on national leadership, political leadership, that moved the country forward with confidence and a common purpose. That's what our founding fathers did after winning independence, when they tied together the economies of the 13 states and created the American market. That's what Lincoln did right in the middle of the Civil War. He pushed for a transcontinental railroad. He incorporated our National Academy of Sciences. He passed the Homestead Act. He created our system of land-grant colleges. That's what FDR did in confronting capitalism's gravest crisis, when he forged the social safety net, built the Hoover Dam, created the Tennessee Valley Authority, and invested in an arsenal of democracy. And that's what Kennedy did in the dark days of the Cold War, when he called us to a new frontier, created the Apollo program, and put us on a pathway to the moon. This was leadership that had the strength to turn moments of adversity into opportunity. Leadership that had the wisdom to see a little further down the road and around that next corner. Leadership that had the courage to challenge conventional thinking and worn ideas so that we could reinvent our economy to seize the future. And unfortunately, that's not the kind of leadership that we've seen out of Washington recently. But that's the kind of leadership I intend to provide when I am President of the United States of America. These past 8 years will be remembered for misguided policies, missed opportunities, a rigid and ideological adherence to discredited ideas. Almost a decade into this century, we still have no real strategy to compete in a global economy.
The final thing we can explore here in this slightly longer lecture than the other ones is how globalization varies from the local to the global scale. Because things are going to look a lot different and have different effects at those different scales, okay? So let's look at economy and culture, just like what our book is going to kind of focus on as far as human geography. When we're talking about globalization of the economy, at the global scale, we are increasingly interconnected and interdependent. But when you zoom in at the local scale, like at the country scale or even the city scale, this has led to increasing specialization, places focusing on their unique assets, if they have any, whether that's, minerals that they can mine or cheap labor or their manufacturing capability. This has meant that places have become less independent as at the global scale, places have become more interdependent. When we talk about the globalization of culture at the global scale, we're becoming more culturally uniform, right? We see similar fast food restaurants, hotel chains, models of car, cell phone styles, right? iPhones and Androids distributed globally as a part of this globalized material culture. And they look pretty much the same no matter where you go in the world. But at the local scale, we see a lot of groups fighting to retain their local cultures, sometimes violently, right, in the face of that onslaught of a global culture. So the effects that this is having globally and locally vary dramatically, from something that's being embraced when you kind of look at it globally to something that's being very disruptive at the local scales. All right, that concludes lecture number 7 here on the concept of movement. I hope that helps you guys understand some of those ideas a little bit better. And I'll talk to you in the final chunk of this kind of group of lectures here when we talk about the concept of region. Thanks a lot, guys, and talk to you again real soon.